I stared at my boss, Gerald, as he leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. "We're promoting my son Brandon," he announced casually, like he was discussing the weather. "Your role isn't essential anymore. Just paperwork, really." Security guards flanked me as I clutched my cardboard box, walking through the lobby of Meridian Technologies for what I thought was the last time. Then Chairman William Hartford appeared, intercepting us near the glass doors. He didn't yell at Gerald. He just grabbed his arm, his face completely drained of color, and whispered urgently, "Get her back in here. Now." 3 months earlier, everything seemed normal at Meridian Technologies. I had been their senior compliance specialist for 6 years, armed with an MBA in regulatory affairs and a deep understanding of pharmaceutical industry requirements. The company specialized in developing diabetes medications, and we had just completed Phase 3 trials for our breakthrough drug, glycobalance. That Tuesday morning in February, I was reviewing adverse event reports when something caught my attention. The numbers didn't add up. According to our clinical trial data, we had documented 37 serious adverse events during the 12-month study period. However, the FDA submission forms only reported 22 incidents. I double-checked my calculations, cross-referencing patient files with regulatory documents. The discrepancy was undeniable. 15 serious adverse events had been omitted from our FDA submissions. This wasn't a simple clerical error. Someone had deliberately excluded critical safety information that could affect millions of diabetic patients. My hands trembled slightly as I printed the evidence. In the pharmaceutical industry, adverse event reporting isn't optional paperwork. It's the cornerstone of patient safety. The FDA requires complete transparency about every serious side effect, every hospitalization, every death that occurs during clinical trials. Failing to report these events could result in criminal charges, billions in fines, and immediate product recalls. I walked directly to Gerald Morrison's office on the 15th floor. Gerald had been promoted to Vice President of Operations 18 months ago, despite having no regulatory background. His previous experience was in sales, where cutting corners and bending rules might boost quarterly numbers. In compliance, that approach could destroy lives. "Gerald, we have a serious problem," I said, placing the documents on his mahogany desk. "Our adverse event reporting is incomplete. We're missing 15 serious incidents in our FDA submissions." He barely glanced at the papers. "Elena, you worry too much about every little detail. Those events were probably unrelated to our medication anyway. That's not our decision to make," I replied firmly. "The FDA determines relatedness. Our job is to report everything transparently. If they discover these omissions during their review, Meridian could face criminal prosecution." Gerald leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Listen, we're not going to torpedo a $200 million product launch over some theoretical paperwork concerns. The medication is safe. Those patients probably had underlying conditions. Gerald, this isn't theoretical. Federal regulations require complete adverse event disclosure. If FDA investigators find unreported events, they'll assume we're hiding information. They could classify this as fraud." His face reddened. "Are you questioning my judgment, Elena? Because I'm getting tired of your regulatory paranoia. Every time we're on the verge of success, you find some obscure rule to worry about." I felt my stomach tighten. These aren't obscure rules. They're fundamental patient safety requirements. If someone dies from an unreported side effect, we could be criminally liable. "Enough," Gerald snapped. "I'm not changing our submission. Those events were coincidental. End of discussion." Over the following weeks, I attempted to escalate my concerns through proper channels. I documented everything in detailed emails, created comprehensive reports outlining the regulatory risks, and even requested meetings with the legal department. Each attempt met resistance. Gerald consistently blocked my access to senior leadership, claiming he was handling the situation internally. During team meetings, He dismissed my warnings as excessive caution that could harm company profitability. He began describing me as overly focused on theoretical compliance issues rather than practical business solutions. Meanwhile, I discovered additional problems. Quality control reports had been altered to hide manufacturing defects. Vendor payments included unexplained consulting fees that violated FDA conflict of interest regulations. Clinical trial protocols had been modified without proper documentation or regulatory approval. Each discovery painted a picture of systematic regulatory violations. Gerald wasn't just ignoring adverse events. He was actively undermining compliance across multiple departments. When I attempted to document these findings, I found that my access to certain databases had been restricted. Then came the announcement about Brandon Morrison, Gerald's 23-year-old son. Brandon had graduated from college 6 months earlier with a degree in marketing. He had no pharmaceutical experience, no regulatory training, and no understanding of FDA requirements. Yet Gerald announced that Brandon would be joining the compliance team as a special projects coordinator. During Brandon's first week, Gerald scheduled a private meeting with both of us. "Brandon is going to take over some of your responsibilities, Elena," he announced. "You can train him on the basic compliance tasks. Nothing too complicated, just the routine paperwork." I stared at him in disbelief. "Compliance isn't routine paperwork, Gerald. These are complex regulatory requirements that require years of specialized training. Don't overcomplicate things," Gerald replied dismissively. "Brandon is sharp. He'll pick it up quickly." The climactic moment came when I accessed my computer the following Monday morning. Every compliance report I had created documenting the adverse event discrepancies had vanished from the company server. My carefully documented evidence of regulatory violations, my detailed analyses of FDA requirements, my recommendations for corrective actions, everything had been systematically deleted. I immediately contacted IT support, asking about data recovery possibilities. The technician explained that the files had been permanently removed by someone with administrative access. The deletion timestamps showed they had been erased over the weekend while I was at home. Gerald had eliminated what he considered the problem, not the actual regulatory violations, but my documentation of them. He believed that destroying the evidence would make the issues disappear. In his mind, if there were no reports highlighting the violations, then the violations didn't exist. Monday morning arrived with unusually heavy rain, as if the weather was setting the stage for what was about to unfold. I had just settled at my desk when Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources appeared, her face wearing that carefully neutral expression HR professionals master for difficult conversations. "Elena, Gerald would like to see you in his office," she said quietly. "I'll be joining you for the meeting." My stomach dropped. HR attendance at management meetings typically meant one thing: termination. I gathered my composure and walked to Gerald's corner office, noting how he had rearranged the furniture to create a more intimidating atmosphere. His desk was positioned to force visitors to look up at him, and he had removed the comfortable chairs, leaving only hard wooden seats. Brandon sat beside his father, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He avoided eye contact, fidgeting with his phone like a teenager called to the principal's office. Gerald, meanwhile, projected an air of smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "Please sit down, Elena," Gerald began, his tone artificially formal. "We need to discuss some organizational changes that will be taking effect immediately." Sarah opened a manila folder and extracted several documents. I recognized the standard termination paperwork from my years in corporate environments. My heart raced, but I maintained a professional demeanor. "Due to budget constraints and operational efficiency requirements," Gerald continued, reading from prepared notes, "we're eliminating several redundant positions. Your role as senior compliance specialist falls into this category." I kept my voice steady. "Can you explain how compliance is considered redundant in a pharmaceutical company? We've determined that many of your responsibilities involve basic administrative tasks that can be handled more cost-effectively," he replied. Brandon will be taking over the essential compliance functions at a salary that's more appropriate for the actual workload. The insult was deliberate. Gerald was characterizing 6 years of specialized expertise as basic administrative tasks while handing complex regulatory responsibilities to his unqualified son. He was betting that I would accept this humiliation quietly to avoid a scene. Gerald, compliance requires extensive regulatory knowledge and FDA training, I said firmly. Brandon lacks the qualifications for these responsibilities. That's where you're wrong, Gerald interrupted. Compliance is really just following checklists and filing paperwork. Brandon has excellent organizational skills and fresh perspectives that aren't clouded by unnecessary bureaucracy. Brandon finally spoke up, his voice betraying nervousness despite his attempt at confidence. I've been studying the regulations, and they seem pretty straightforward. Most of it is just common sense. I stared at him in amazement. Brandon, adverse event reporting alone involves dozens of federal regulations, complex database systems, and detailed medical terminology. Have you completed any FDA training programs? I don't think we need to get into specifics. Gerald interjected. The decision has been made. Sarah will explain your severance package and transition timeline. Sarah shifted uncomfortably and began outlining the termination details. 2 weeks severance pay, immediate loss of access to company systems, and a requirement to return all company property before leaving the building. The package was deliberately minimal, designed to discourage any legal challenges. Your personal belongings need to be packed today, Sarah continued. Security will escort you to your desk, and then to the exit to ensure proper protocol is followed. The security guards appeared at Gerald's door right on schedule. Tom and Marcus, 2 men I had greeted cordially every morning for years, now stood ready to treat me like a potential threat. Their embarrassed expressions suggested they found this assignment as uncomfortable as I did. I maintained my dignity throughout the humiliating process of packing 6 years of professional life into a cardboard box. Colleagues watched from their cubicles as news of my termination spread through whispered conversations and shocked expressions. Several people approached to express private support, but they kept their voices low, afraid of becoming Gerald's next target. My hands remained steady as I collected personal photographs, awards for regulatory excellence, and training certificates from professional development programs. Each item represented years of dedication to protecting patient safety and ensuring regulatory compliance. Gerald was discarding all of that expertise to promote his unqualified son. The walk through Meridian's hallways felt endless. Employees pretended to focus on their work, while stealing glances at the security escort. I had walked these same corridors thousands of times as a respected professional. Now I was being paraded out like a criminal. We approached the glass doors leading to the main lobby when everything changed. Chairman William Hartford suddenly appeared, having just exited the elevator from the executive floors. When he saw me being escorted out with my cardboard box, his expression shifted from surprise to alarm to absolute horror. William Hartford was a seasoned pharmaceutical executive with 30 years of industry experience. He had guided companies through FDA inspections, regulatory crises, and compliance challenges. Unlike Gerald, he understood exactly what my termination meant for Meridian's regulatory standing. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of executive leadership. Gerald appeared from behind us, probably having followed to ensure my departure was completed. "We've made some staffing adjustments, Bill, eliminating redundant positions to improve efficiency." William's face went completely pale as the implications hit him. His hands actually trembled slightly as he grabbed Gerald's arm with surprising force. The lobby fell silent as other employees sensed the tension. "Get her back in here," William whispered urgently, his voice barely audible but carrying unmistakable desperation. Now, the climactic moment had arrived. I watched Gerald's smug confidence evaporate as he realized that William knew something he didn't. The chairman's reaction revealed that my termination wasn't just a personnel decision, it was a catastrophic mistake that threatened the entire company's survival. Within minutes, I found myself in Meridian's main conference room, my cardboard box sitting awkwardly on the polished mahogany table. William Hartford paced anxiously while Gerald stood frozen, finally beginning to understand that his confidence had been misplaced. 20 minutes ago, I received a call from the FDA, William began, his voice tight with controlled panic. They're conducting a surprise compliance inspection starting this Monday. Someone filed an anonymous complaint about adverse event reporting violations. Gerald's face went ashen. An anonymous complaint? Who would do that? That's not the important question right now, William snapped. The important question is whether we can survive what's coming. Do you understand what an FDA surprise inspection means, Gerald? I watched Gerald struggle to respond. His sales background hadn't prepared him for regulatory emergencies. He understood profit margins and market share, but FDA enforcement actions were completely outside his expertise. It means they suspect serious violations, I said quietly. Anonymous complaints usually involve whistleblowers who have specific knowledge of regulatory failures. William nodded grimly. Exactly. They're not coming for a routine review. They believe we've violated federal law, and they're bringing criminal investigators. The blood drained from Gerald's face as the full implications became clear. FDA criminal investigations weren't administrative inconveniences. They could result in individual prosecutions, massive fines, product recalls, and criminal convictions for corporate executives. But we've been following all the regulations, Gerald protested weakly. Elena was just being overly cautious about theoretical concerns. Theoretical concerns? William's voice rose dangerously. Gerald, adverse event reporting is a federal requirement. If we've failed to report serious side effects, executives can face criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. I had remained silent. But William's desperate expression told me that my expertise was desperately needed. Chairman Hartford, what specific areas is the FDA planning to investigate? Adverse event reporting, clinical trial documentation, and manufacturing quality controls, he replied. They mentioned discrepancies between our internal safety data and FDA submissions. My heart sank. Those were exactly the issues I had been trying to raise with Gerald for months. The anonymous complaint had probably come from someone with access to the same information I had discovered. The missing adverse events, the altered quality reports, the undocumented protocol changes. Gerald, I said carefully. Remember those 15 adverse events I brought to your attention 3 months ago? The ones missing from our FDA submissions? Those were unrelated to our medication, Gerald insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. That's not our determination to make, William interjected sharply. The FDA decides relatedness. Our job is complete transparency. He turned to me with desperate hope. Elena, do you have documentation of these missing events? This was the moment I had been preparing for, even though I hadn't known it at the time. Yes, I do. I maintained personal copies of all compliance documentation, anticipating exactly this scenario. The room fell silent. Gerald stared at me in shock, realizing that his deletion of company files hadn't eliminated the evidence. Brandon shifted nervously, beginning to understand that his new position involved responsibilities that could land him in federal prison. I have complete records of the unreported adverse events, the quality control discrepancies, and my attempts to escalate these concerns through proper channels, I continued. I also have documentation showing that my access to company systems was restricted when I tried to address these issues. William's relief was palpable. Can you guide us through the FDA inspection? Can you help us demonstrate that we attempted to address these problems? I looked at Gerald, whose arrogance had been replaced by desperate fear. The man who had dismissed my expertise as unnecessary bureaucracy now needed that same expertise to avoid criminal prosecution. I can help, I said slowly, but we need to discuss my role and authority moving forward. That's when Brandon made a crucial mistake. Dad, can't we just tell the FDA that those adverse events were unrelated? I mean, if patients had other medical problems, our medication probably wasn't responsible. William and I exchanged horrified glances. Brandon's comment revealed not just his complete ignorance of FDA regulations, but his willingness to suggest misleading federal investigators. In pharmaceutical compliance, such statements could be interpreted as conspiracy to defraud. Brandon, William said carefully, suggesting that we mislead federal investigators is a felony. FDA agents are trained to detect deception, and they're already suspicious about our reporting practices. The climactic revelation came when I opened my laptop and accessed my personal files. There's something else you need to know. The compliance violations weren't just oversights. Someone with administrative access deleted my original reports from the company server over the weekend. I showed them the timestamps and deletion logs I had documented. Gerald's face went white as he realized I had evidence of his deliberate obstruction of compliance efforts. This suggests intentional concealment of regulatory violations, William said quietly. That's not just a compliance issue. That's potential criminal conspiracy. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of the situation. Gerald's attempt to eliminate the problem by firing me and deleting evidence had actually created a much bigger crisis. Now they faced not just regulatory violations, but evidence of deliberate obstruction that could trigger criminal prosecution. The dynamic in the conference room had completely shifted. William Hartford took control with the decisive authority of someone accustomed to crisis management, while Gerald sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the catastrophic consequences of his actions. "Elena, I need to ask you directly," William began. "Will you help us navigate this FDA inspection? We clearly need your expertise." I had spent months watching Gerald dismiss my warnings and undermine my authority. Now he needed the very expertise he had characterized as unnecessary bureaucracy. This was my opportunity to establish the conditions necessary to actually protect the company and its patients. "I'm willing to help," I replied carefully, "but I need certain assurances about my role and authority." "Name them," William said without hesitation. "First, I want to be reinstated as Chief Compliance Officer, reporting directly to you rather than through Gerald. Second, I need complete authority over all regulatory matters, with the power to halt operations if necessary to ensure compliance. Third, I want a substantial salary increase reflecting the critical nature of this work." Gerald started to object, but William silenced him with a sharp look. "Agreed. What else?" "Brandon needs to be transferred out of compliance immediately. This isn't about punishment. It's about qualifications. Compliance requires specialized training that takes years to develop." Brandon's face reddened with indignation. "That's not fair. I've been studying the regulations. I understand the basics." "The basics?" I replied firmly. "Can you explain the difference between expedited and periodic adverse event reports? Do you know the criteria for classifying events as serious? Can you navigate the FDA's MedWatch database?" Brandon stared at me blankly, confirming what everyone already knew. He was completely unqualified for compliance responsibilities. "There's one more requirement," I continued. "Gerald needs to send a company-wide email acknowledging his mistakes and publicly supporting my authority in compliance matters. The entire organization needs to understand that regulatory requirements are non-negotiable." Gerald's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You're trying to embarrass me in front of the whole company." "I'm trying to save the company from criminal prosecution," I replied calmly. "Your dismissal of compliance warnings has created this crisis. Employees need to know that regulatory requirements have full executive support." William nodded decisively. "Done. Sarah, please draft the necessary paperwork for Elena's promotion and salary adjustment. Gerald, you'll send that company-wide email before the end of the day." The legal team joined us within the hour to formalize my new position and discuss litigation risks. Lead counsel Jennifer Walsh confirmed that my documentation could provide crucial protection against criminal charges by demonstrating good faith compliance efforts. "The fact that Elena raised these concerns through proper channels and was ignored actually helps our defense," Jennifer explained. We can show that the company had employees trying to ensure compliance, even if management failed to respond appropriately. As we finalized the details of my reinstatement, Gerald made one last attempt to salvage his authority. This seems like an overreaction. We can address these issues without completely restructuring the compliance department. Before anyone could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent message. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. The FDA investigators just arrived, I announced. They're requesting an immediate meeting with the chief compliance officer. Gerald instinctively started to stand, but I remained seated. That would be me now, I said firmly. The climactic moment arrived when Gerald, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, declared that Brandon should join the meeting as the assistant compliance officer. We walked to the lobby where 3 FDA investigators waited with briefcases and tablets, clearly prepared for a comprehensive review. I'm Dr. Patricia Reynolds, FDA compliance investigator. The lead investigator introduced herself. We need to speak with your chief compliance officer about adverse event reporting practices. Gerald stepped forward. This is Brandon Morrison, our compliance specialist. Dr. Reynolds looked at Brandon expectantly. Can you walk us through your adverse event reporting procedures? Brandon's face went pale. Well, we follow all the standard protocols. We make sure everything is properly documented according to the basic requirements. Dr. Reynolds frowned. Can you be more specific? What's your time frame for reporting serious, unexpected adverse reactions? Brandon stammered. 15 days for serious events? That's incorrect, Dr. Reynolds said sharply. Serious, unexpected adverse reactions must be reported within 15 days for studies conducted under IND regulations, but 7 days for certain life-threatening events, and immediately for deaths that are both unexpected and related to the investigational product. Brandon looked confused and panicked. Dr. Reynolds turned to William with obvious concern. Chairman Hartford, we need to speak with someone who actually understands FDA compliance requirements. That's when I stepped forward. I'm Elena Parker, Chief Compliance Officer. I can answer your questions and provide the documentation you need. Dr. Reynolds visibly relaxed. Ms. Parker, we've received reports of unreported adverse events in your glycobalance trials. Can you explain your reporting procedures? The investigators had nearly escalated the situation to criminal referral based on Brandon's incompetence. Gerald's nepotistic appointment had almost triggered the exact outcome we were trying to avoid. Federal investigators concluding that the company lacked qualified compliance leadership. Over the following 3 days, I guided Meridian through the most intensive regulatory scrutiny in its corporate history. Dr. Reynolds and her team examined every aspect of our compliance programs, from adverse event databases to manufacturing quality controls. My meticulous documentation proved invaluable in demonstrating our attempts to address regulatory concerns. The FDA investigators were thorough and professional, but their questions revealed the depth of their suspicions. They had received detailed allegations about systematic violations, suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of our operations had filed the complaint. Ms. Parker, Dr. Reynolds said during our 3rd meeting, your documentation shows consistent efforts to escalate compliance concerns. Can you explain why these issues weren't addressed by management? I chose my words carefully. I repeatedly brought these matters to the attention of my supervisor, Gerald Morrison. My recommendations for corrective action were not implemented. Dr. Reynolds made notes on her tablet. Your supervisor is the vice president of operations? Does he have regulatory training? No, his background is in sales. The investigator's eyebrows rose slightly. In pharmaceutical companies, putting sales executives in charge of compliance was like appointing someone with no medical training to perform surgery. The priorities were fundamentally incompatible. As the investigation deepened, more serious issues emerged. The FDA team discovered that Gerald had approved vendor contracts containing hidden consulting fees that violated conflict of interest regulations. Clinical trial protocols had been modified without proper documentation or regulatory notification. Quality control reports had been altered to hide manufacturing defects. Each discovery painted a picture of systematic regulatory violations orchestrated by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the pharmaceutical industry's legal requirements. Gerald hadn't just made mistakes. He had actively undermined compliance safeguards designed to protect patients. The most damaging revelation came when investigators accessed Gerald's email communications. They found messages instructing staff to streamline reporting procedures and focus on business priorities rather than regulatory bureaucracy. One email specifically directed the quality control manager to resolve manufacturing issues without creating unnecessary paperwork. In pharmaceutical compliance, such communications were smoking guns. They demonstrated deliberate indifference to regulatory requirements and suggested a pattern of obstruction that could support criminal charges. Dr. Reynolds called me into a private meeting on Thursday afternoon. "Miss Parker, we've discovered evidence of financial irregularities in addition to compliance violations. Have you observed any suspicious vendor relationships?" This was the moment when Gerald's deeper corruption began to surface. "I've noticed unusually high consulting fees to certain vendors, particularly those involved in clinical trial management and quality testing." The investigator nodded grimly. "We're referring those matters to our Office of Criminal Investigations. It appears your supervisor may have been receiving kickbacks in exchange for overlooking quality control failures." The pieces suddenly fell into place. Gerald's hostility toward compliance oversight wasn't just incompetence. It was self-interest. He had been taking money from vendors who wanted to cut corners on quality requirements. My insistence on proper documentation threatened to expose his corruption. That explains his resistance to compliance reporting. I realized aloud. If vendors were paying him to ignore quality issues, then thorough documentation would reveal the problems he was being paid to hide. Dr. Reynolds confirmed my suspicions. We found substantial cash deposits in accounts linked to Mr. Morrison that correspond with vendor payment schedules. This appears to be a systematic bribery scheme involving multiple suppliers. The climactic revelation came when investigators interviewed Brandon Morrison separately. Under pressure from experienced federal agents, he revealed that his father had specifically hired him to replace me with someone who would be more flexible about compliance requirements. Brandon told investigators that Gerald explicitly instructed him to focus on basic paperwork rather than substantive compliance analysis, Dr. Reynolds informed me. "Your replacement was intended to be a compliant figurehead who wouldn't question questionable practices." I felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. Gerald hadn't just fired me for budgetary reasons. He had eliminated me because my professional integrity threatened his criminal enterprise. Brandon wasn't just an unqualified hire. He was a deliberate accomplice in circumventing regulatory oversight. The investigation also revealed that Gerald had been systematically deleting my compliance reports, not to hide theoretical problems, but to conceal evidence of his kickback arrangements. My documentation of vendor irregularities and quality control failures would have exposed his corruption if it had reached senior leadership. "Your documentation has been crucial in helping us understand the scope of these violations," Dr. Reynolds told me. "Without your records, we might not have discovered the financial fraud underlying the compliance failures." As the FDA completed their on-site investigation, William Hartford called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. The evidence of criminal activity required immediate action to protect the company's reputation and avoid further legal liability. Gerald Morrison is facing federal charges for fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice, William announced to the assembled board members. Brandon Morrison is being investigated as a potential accomplice. We need to take decisive action to demonstrate that this corruption doesn't represent company policy. Friday morning brought the confrontation I had been anticipating for months. William Hartford, accompanied by legal counsel and security personnel, called Gerald into the conference room for a formal termination meeting. I was asked to attend as a witness and to provide technical expertise about the compliance violations. Gerald entered the room with false confidence, still believing he could manipulate his way out of accountability. He had spent the week trying to blame others for problems he had created, suggesting that overzealous regulators were persecuting the company for minor technical violations. "Gerald," William began formally, "we're terminating your employment immediately based on evidence of criminal conduct discovered during the FDA investigation." Gerald's facade crumbled instantly. Criminal conduct? This is about compliance paperwork. Every company has minor regulatory issues. Jennifer Walsh, our legal counsel, opened a thick folder containing evidence compiled by federal investigators. Gerald, this isn't about paperwork. You've been receiving kickbacks from vendors in exchange for ignoring quality control failures. That's bribery and fraud. Those were legitimate consulting arrangements, Gerald protested weakly. Legitimate consulting arrangements require disclosure and approval. I interjected. You concealed these payments while making decisions that benefited those same vendors. That's the definition of corruption. Jennifer continued methodically through the evidence. Bank records showing cash deposits corresponding to vendor payment schedules. Email communications directing staff to ignore quality problems. Documentation showing Gerald's active obstruction of compliance efforts designed to protect patient safety. The FBI has obtained warrants to search your home and personal accounts, William informed him. They're treating this as organized criminal activity involving multiple co-conspirators. Gerald's desperation became palpable as he realized the scope of the investigation. This is insane. I was trying to make the company more profitable. Every decision I made was intended to help Meridian succeed. You were helping yourself succeed at the company's expense, I replied firmly. Patient safety isn't negotiable for personal profit. The most damaging moment came when investigators brought in evidence of Gerald's instructions to Brandon. Recorded conversations revealed that Gerald had explicitly told his son to avoid thorough compliance analysis and to rubber-stamp vendor relationships without substantive review. You didn't just hire Brandon through nepotism, William said with disgust. You hired him to be complicit in your criminal scheme. You were planning to use your own son as a front for fraud. Brandon was escorted in for his own termination meeting, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine fear. The federal investigation had revealed his knowledge of and participation in his father's corruption. While his culpability was less than Gerald's, he faced serious legal consequences for his willing participation. I thought I was just helping my dad streamline operations, Brandon said pitifully. Streamlining operations by ignoring safety regulations and facilitating bribery, Jennifer replied coldly. That's criminal conspiracy, not business efficiency. The media had begun covering the story by afternoon. Pharmaceutical executive faces federal fraud charges read the headline in the industry trade publication. Gerald's corruption had become a public scandal that damaged not just his reputation, but Meridian's standing in the pharmaceutical community. Federal agents arrived to formally arrest Gerald as he cleaned out his office. The sight of FBI agents escorting him from the building in handcuffs provided a stark contrast to my own departure just days earlier. This time, security guards were protecting the company from a criminal rather than escorting out a dedicated professional. The climactic confrontation occurred when Gerald made a final desperate attempt to shift blame onto me. As federal agents prepared to take him into custody, he turned and pointed accusingly in my direction. "This is all her fault," Gerald shouted. Elena Parker created this entire crisis with her obsessive focus on minor technical violations. She sabotaged the company because I made reasonable management decisions she disagreed with. Dr. Reynolds, who was observing the arrest, responded with professional disdain. "Mr. Morrison, our investigation found extensive evidence of your criminal activity dating back 2 years. Miss Parker's compliance efforts were the only thing preventing even more serious violations. She was threatening my job for raising legitimate compliance concerns," I added firmly. "Your own emails show that you specifically ordered staff to ignore regulatory requirements. That's not a management disagreement. That's criminal obstruction." Gerald's final words before being arrested revealed the depth of his selfishness and denial. I was protecting the company from regulatory overreach. Pharmaceutical regulations are designed to help lawyers and bureaucrats, not patients. As the FBI led Gerald away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness. Relief that the corruption had been exposed, and stopped. Vindication that my professional concerns had been proven correct. Sadness that so much damage had been caused by one person's greed and arrogance. Brandon accepted a plea agreement to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. He would face probation and community service rather than prison time, but his career in pharmaceuticals was permanently destroyed. His cooperation would help prosecutors build a stronger case against Gerald and other potential co-conspirators. The investigation expanded to include vendors who had participated in the bribery scheme. Several contract research organizations and testing laboratories faced their own federal charges for providing kickbacks in exchange for favorable treatment. Gerald's corruption had infected multiple companies throughout the pharmaceutical supply chain. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where my career at Meridian had nearly ended. But now, the atmosphere was completely transformed. The walls displayed new compliance certifications and awards, recognizing our industry-leading regulatory program. Where Gerald's intimidating furniture had once dominated the space, we had created a collaborative environment that encouraged transparency and ethical decision-making. Gerald Morrison had been convicted on all counts of fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The federal judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $2 million in restitution to Meridian Technologies and affected patients. During his sentencing hearing, the judge specifically noted the callous disregard for patient safety in pursuit of personal profit. Brandon Morrison completed his community service requirement by volunteering at medical clinics serving underprivileged patients. The experience exposed him to the real-world consequences of pharmaceutical safety, helping him understand why regulatory compliance matters beyond corporate profits. He eventually found work in medical device sales, where his criminal record and industry reputation severely limited his career prospects. My transformation from terminated employee to industry leader had been remarkable. As Chief Compliance Officer, I had implemented comprehensive reforms that became a model for other pharmaceutical companies. Our adverse event reporting program achieved a 99% accuracy rate. Our vendor oversight procedures eliminated conflicts of interest. Our employee training programs ensured that every staff member understood their role in protecting patient safety. The FDA had recognized our transformation by removing Meridian from their enhanced monitoring list 6 months ahead of schedule. Dr. Reynolds personally commended our compliance program as an exemplary demonstration of corporate accountability and regulatory excellence. More importantly, our cultural transformation had empowered employees throughout the organization to prioritize patient safety over short-term profits. Staff members now felt comfortable raising compliance concerns without fear of retaliation. Middle managers understood that regulatory requirements were business necessities, not bureaucratic obstacles. My professional reputation had grown beyond Meridian's walls. The Pharmaceutical Industry Association invited me to speak at their annual conference about transforming compliance culture. Medical schools requested guest lectures about the ethical foundations of drug development. The Harvard Business School asked me to contribute to their case study on corporate governance in regulated industries. The book deal surprised me most of all. Compliance Conscience: How One Professional's Stand Against Corruption Saved Lives became required reading in pharmaceutical compliance training programs. The advance allowed me to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in regulatory affairs. Personal growth accompanied professional success. The experience had taught me that expertise combined with courage could overcome institutional corruption. Standing up for principles, even when threatened, ultimately protected everyone: patients, employees, and even the company itself. I had also learned to recognize warning signs of compliance failure before they became crises. My team developed predictive analytics that identified potential violations months before they occurred. We created early intervention protocols that addressed problems through training and process improvement rather than punishment and blame. The most satisfying transformation involved the employees Gerald had intimidated into silence. Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources became a passionate advocate for compliance culture. The quality control manager, freed from pressure to hide manufacturing problems, implemented innovations that actually improved efficiency while ensuring safety. Clinical trial coordinators developed new documentation procedures that exceeded FDA requirements. These colleagues had always wanted to do the right thing. They simply needed leadership that supported ethical decision-making over political maneuvering. Gerald's departure removed the toxic influence that had corrupted an otherwise principled organization. On the 6-month anniversary of my reinstatement, William Hartford surprised me with a special recognition ceremony. The entire company gathered in the main auditorium as he presented me with Meridian's first-ever Excellence in Integrity Award. Elena Parker exemplifies the values that define our company's mission, William announced to thunderous applause. Her courage in standing up for patient safety, even at personal risk, demonstrates the kind of leadership that makes pharmaceutical innovation possible. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, with colleagues who had witnessed my humiliation now celebrating my vindication. It was a powerful reminder that principled professionals were the foundation of every successful organization. My closing thoughts centered on the broader lessons this experience offered for anyone facing ethical dilemmas in their career. Professional integrity isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding that expertise carries responsibility. When we possess knowledge that protects others, staying silent in the face of wrongdoing becomes complicity in potential harm. The pharmaceutical industry exists to heal and help patients who trust us with their lives. Every compliance requirement, every safety protocol, every regulatory burden exists because someone, somewhere, was harmed when those protections didn't exist. My role wasn't to generate paperwork or satisfy bureaucrats. It was to ensure that desperate patients received safe and effective treatments, rather than products compromised by greed or carelessness. Gerald's corruption had been enabled by a culture that prioritized profits over people and treated regulatory requirements as inconvenient obstacles rather than essential safeguards. Transforming that culture required more than new policies and procedures. It demanded leadership willing to demonstrate that ethical behavior would be supported and rewarded, while corruption would be exposed and punished. The experience also reinforced my belief that expertise is never truly non-essential when lives are at stake. Organizations that dismiss specialized knowledge in favor of cost-cutting or political considerations ultimately pay much higher prices in terms of legal liability, regulatory scrutiny, and damaged reputations. True efficiency comes from doing things right the first time, not from cutting corners and dealing with consequences later. As I reflected on this journey, I realized that my story represents thousands of professionals who face similar choices every day. Healthcare workers who report safety violations despite management pressure. Financial analysts who identify fraud despite career risks. Engineers who refuse to approve unsafe designs despite deadline pressures. Teachers who advocate for student welfare despite administrative resistance. These moments define not just individual careers, but the ethical foundation of entire industries. When principled professionals stand up for their values, they protect not just immediate stakeholders, but the broader public trust that makes professional expertise meaningful and valuable. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing professionally put your job at risk? How did you handle the pressure to stay silent when you knew something was wrong? I'd love to hear your experiences and thoughts about standing up for professional principles in challenging circumstances. Please share your story in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about everyday professionals who made extraordinary stands for their values. And please share this with anyone who might be facing similar workplace dilemmas. Sometimes knowing that others have successfully stood up for what's right can provide the courage needed to do the same. Thank you for joining me on this journey from termination to vindication. Remember that your professional integrity isn't just about your career. It's about the people whose lives depend on you doing your job with excellence, honesty, and courage. Stay strong, stay principled, and never let anyone convince you that expertise dedicated to protecting others is ever non-essential.